January 17, 1945, Leyte Gulf, Philippine Islands. The salt wind carried the scent of diesel fuel and wet canvas across the harbor where USS Constellation rocked gently against her moorings. In the ship's converted cargo hold, 37 Japanese women sat in silence. Nurses, communications officers, civilian auxiliaries pulled from the wreckage of collapsed field hospitals and burning administrative centers across Leyte. Their uniforms, once crisp khaki, now hung in tatters darkened by mud and blood. Outside, the tropical sun hammered down on white-painted steel, but inside the hold, fluorescent lights hummed with a cold, mechanical indifference. The women did not speak. They had been taught that capture meant disgrace worse than death, that American soldiers were demons who would defile and destroy. Now they waited in that fluorescent purgatory for a fate they had been trained to fear more than annihilation itself. But the demons never came. Instead, what arrived was a Navy corpsman carrying boxes of medical supplies, followed by two female Army nurses speaking in gentle, measured tones. What arrived was hot food on metal trays, real rice, canned fruit, condensed milk. What arrived was clean water, antiseptic bandages applied with practiced efficiency to wounds that had festered for days. The women flinched at first contact, bracing for violence that never materialized. The confusion began there, in that cargo hold floating in Leyte Gulf, where the architecture of ideology first showed its cracks. This is not a story that appears in official military histories or patriotic retrospectives. It exists in the margins of intelligence reports, in Red Cross documentation, in scattered memoirs written decades later by women who struggled to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had experienced. It is the story of how physical reality can overwhelm propaganda, how bodies can betray ideology, and how the simple fact of health and vigor can become a more powerful argument than any political speech. It is the story of Japanese female prisoners of war who, in their captivity, encountered not demons, but men whose physical vitality spoke of an abundance so foreign to their experience that it shattered the foundational myths they had carried into battle. The women had come from an empire stretched beyond endurance, where the rhetoric of inevitable victory masked the grinding reality of starvation logistics and industrial collapse. They had served in field hospitals where wounded soldiers died not from American bullets but from gangrene and malnutrition, where surgery was performed without anesthesia because the supply ships never arrived, where nurses worked 18-hour shifts on rations that would have shamed a medieval peasant. They had been told that hardship was virtue, that suffering purified the spirit, that the Americans, soft, decadent, poisoned by materialism, would crumble before Japanese discipline and sacrifice. The imperial propaganda machine had constructed an image of the American soldier as a creature of weakness, overworked and underloved, mechanically dependent, spiritually hollow. Leaflets distributed to Japanese troops showed caricatures of gum-chewing simpletons, muscle-bound but stupid, propped up by machines they barely understood. The message was consistent. American strength was artificial, bought rather than earned, a product of industrial excess rather than warrior spirit. When Japanese forces finally confronted American troops in actual combat, this narrative became harder to maintain, but the ideological apparatus was resilient. Defeats were reframed as tactical withdrawals, American victories attributed to material superiority rather than fighting capability, and the notion that individual American soldiers might actually be healthier, stronger, more physically capable than their Japanese counterparts was simply inadmissible within the conceptual framework that governed Japanese military thought. For the women pulled from the wreckage of Leyte, the first cracks in this framework came not from words but from observation. The American guards assigned to prisoner facilities were not the hollow-eyed scarecrows that 4 years of war had produced among Japanese ranks. They stood straight without effort. Their uniforms fit properly over frames that filled the cloth rather than hanging from protruding bones. They moved with the casual efficiency of bodies that had never known real hunger, that had grown to their full genetic potential unhindered by childhood malnutrition or adolescent food scarcity. They had teeth that were white and straight, skin clear of the lesions that marked vitamin deficiencies, eyes bright with the specific clarity that comes from protein-rich diets and adequate rest. The initial POW processing camps were established quickly as American forces swept through the Philippines in late 1944 and early 1945. These facilities varied in quality and organization, but even the most hastily constructed shared certain baseline characteristics that reflected American logistical abundance. Prisoners received medical screening within 24 hours of capture. Infectious diseases were treated immediately with sulfanilamide and, increasingly, with penicillin, drugs that existed only as rumors in Japanese military medicine. Caloric intake for prisoners was established at levels that exceeded what many Japanese soldiers had received on active duty. The United States military, even in the chaos of active combat operations, maintained supply lines capable of delivering fresh fruit, refrigerated meat, and clean water to forward positions in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to Japanese quartermasters struggling to move rice and pickled vegetables through submarine-infested waters. At Camp Cabanatuan, expanded after liberation to house Japanese prisoners, the contrast became impossible to ignore. American guards assigned to the camp underwent their own training, which included explicit instructions about prisoner treatment under the Geneva Conventions, conventions that Japan had never ratified but which American military command insisted on implementing regardless. These guards worked 8-hour shifts with regular rotations, received 3 full meals daily plus coffee and cigarettes, and had access to recreation facilities during off hours. They played baseball in the compound yard, where prisoners could watch through wire fencing. They lifted weights in makeshift gymnasiums constructed from salvaged equipment. They existed, in full view of the prisoners, as physical specimens of what adequate nutrition and systematic training could produce. The Japanese nurses, whose professional training had given them understanding of human physiology that transcended propaganda, found themselves conducting an involuntary comparative study. They observed that the American guards rarely showed signs of the deficiency diseases that had plagued Japanese military hospitals. No beriberi, no scurvy, minimal dental decay, strong bone structure evident in posture and movement. During medical examinations, conducted with female prisoners attended by female American nurses, whenever possible, the difference in physical development became clinically undeniable. Where Japanese women of that generation averaged 145 centimeters in height and 42 kilograms in weight, shaped by childhoods during economic depression and adolescence during wartime rationing, the American nurses stood noticeably taller, broader in the shoulders, moving with the unconscious confidence of bodies built for endurance. Private records from American personnel assigned to prisoner operations in the Pacific reveal a recurring theme of surprise at the physical condition of Japanese captives. A Navy doctor writing to his wife in March 1945 described examining a group of Japanese military nurses. These women are educated professionals, not combat troops or civilians caught in the wrong place, but their medical condition would qualify them for hospital admission stateside. Anemia, vitamin deficiencies, healing fractures that were never properly set. One had been conducting surgery with an untreated compound fracture of her left hand. The dedication is extraordinary, but the resource base supporting them is clearly exhausted. They look at our nurses with the same puzzlement with which our nurses look at them, mutual incomprehension at different standards of what's normal. The food became its own form of propaganda, more persuasive than any leaflet. Prisoner rations in American custody consisted of approximately 2,800 calories daily, with mandatory inclusion of protein, fresh vegetables, and fruit. For women whose bodies had adapted to wartime Japanese military rations, 1,300 calories on a good day, often less, consisting primarily of rice and pickled radish with occasional fish. The American prison diet represented nutritional abundance beyond their experience. More disturbing than the quantity was the casualness with which it was provided. Guards ate the same food, prepared in the same kitchens, and thought nothing remarkable about it. Coffee was unlimited. Fresh bread appeared daily. Meat came in forms Japanese prisoners had never encountered. Thick cuts of beef, ground and formed into patties, stewed in rich gravies, roasted until the fat ran clear. Yashiko Hasegawa, a communications officer captured during the fall of Manila, wrote in her post-war memoir about the psychological impact of meals in American custody. We had been taught that Americans were weak because they required so much food, that their dependence on material comfort made them inferior soldiers. But watching them eat, seeing the casual abundance, I began to understand that we had confused cause and effect. They were not weak because they ate well. They ate well because their nation could afford to feed them properly, and this was not weakness but strength of a kind we had failed to comprehend. The soldiers guarding us were not soft. They were what properly fed, properly trained human beings looked like. We had mistaken our own deprivation for virtue. The athletic culture of American military life became impossible to ignore. In the tropical heat of the Philippines, soldiers exercised shirtless, and the female prisoners, housed in adjacent compounds or assigned to work details that brought them into proximity with American personnel, could not avoid witnessing physical training that was both routine and, to eyes trained in Japanese military aesthetics, almost shocking in its casual display. American soldiers played basketball during off-duty hours, their movements demonstrating reserves of energy that seemed inexhaustible. They ran recreational races, swam in rivers deemed safe for recreation, engaged in boxing matches and wrestling tournaments organized for entertainment rather than combat preparation. The Japanese military tradition emphasized endurance through deprivation, building fighting spirit by pushing men beyond physical limits with minimal support. American military doctrine emphasized building physical capacity through systematic training and optimal nutrition. The results were visible in every interaction. When American guards assisted in moving supplies, they lifted weights that would have required 2 or 3 Japanese soldiers. When they worked in the tropical sun, they sweated freely but recovered quickly. Their bodies adapted to high exertion through years of athletic conditioning. The female prisoners, many of whom had tended to wounded soldiers reduced to skeletal fragility by starvation and disease, found themselves confronted with a vision of masculinity built on health rather than sacrifice. The aesthetic dimension of this encounter carried ideological implications that both sides understood but rarely articulated. Japanese military propaganda had portrayed American masculinity as corrupt, soft bodies pampered by luxury, moral fiber weakened by individualism and material indulgence. The physical reality presented by American soldiers stationed in the Philippines contradicted this narrative at the most fundamental level. These were not soft bodies. They were not weak. The breadth of their shoulders, the definition of their musculature, the easy athleticism of their movement all testified to lives lived with nutritional security and opportunity for physical development. For women raised in a culture that valorized self-sacrifice and portrayed deprivation as character building, the encounter with bodies built through abundance rather than denial represented a philosophical challenge as much as a physical one. American military culture in 1945 was intensely athletic in ways that reflected broader national values. The democratization of sports in American life, baseball as national pastime, high school football as community ritual, boxing as immigrant integration mechanism, had created a population with deep familiarity with systematic training and competitive physical culture. Military service built on this foundation, with regular physical training, recreational sports programs, and cultural emphasis on fitness as both individual responsibility and collective benefit. The result was a military force that, whatever its other characteristics, was physically more robust than any comparable force in the world at that moment in history. The Japanese nurses documented this in clinical terms. Medical reports submitted through Red Cross channels and preserved in post-war archives show systematic deterioration of Japanese military personnel condition throughout 1944 and 1945, correlated directly with supply line collapse and resource depletion. Average body weight for Japanese soldiers captured in the Philippines was 11 to 13 kilograms below peacetime norms. Vitamin deficiency diseases were endemic. Tuberculosis rates exceeded 20% in some units. By contrast, American personnel, even those who had been engaged in continuous combat operations, maintained body weight within normal ranges, showed minimal deficiency disease, and demonstrated recovery rates from wounds and illnesses that Japanese medical officers found difficult to credit. The transformation in perspective occurred gradually, in the accumulation of small observations that collectively undermined ideological certainty. A guard sharing his cigarette ration with prisoners, casual generosity that would have been unthinkable in the resource-starved Japanese military. Medical personnel treating prisoner illnesses with the same pharmaceuticals used for American troops, rather than hoarding scarce drugs for their own forces. Food service workers disposing of uneaten portions that represented more nutrition than a Japanese soldier might see in a week. Waste that spoke of abundance, so profound it could afford inefficiency. For some prisoners, the ideological crisis this provoked was manageable through various defensive rationalizations. America's wealth was geographically determined, natural resources that required no particular virtue. American strength was temporary, industrial might that would prove hollow in protracted conflict. American character was still weak, material comfort that masked spiritual poverty. But for others, particularly those whose professional training had given them frameworks for empirical observation that transcended nationalist mythology, the evidence became overwhelming. The American Guards were not weak. Their nation was not decadent. The propaganda had been, at minimum, incomplete, and at maximum, fundamentally wrong about the relationship between material conditions and human capability. The symbolic weight of American physicality bore down most heavily in medical contexts, where professional expertise allowed no comfortable evasions. Japanese nurses had been trained in modern medicine, many at institutions that had imported Western medical knowledge during the Meiji period. They understood germ theory, surgical technique, pharmacology, and nutrition. When they observed American medical personnel at work, they saw not mysterious superiority, but the application of familiar principles supported by resources their own medical service could no longer command. American field hospitals had plasma for transfusions, while Japanese hospitals made do with saline and prayer. American surgery was conducted under anesthesia with sterilized instruments, while Japanese surgeons worked with whatever could be salvaged and boiled. The difference was not knowledge but capacity, not wisdom but wealth. Ryoko Tanaka, a surgical nurse captured on Leyte, described her first encounter with an American field hospital in an interview conducted in the 1970s. I had assisted in hundreds of surgeries under conditions that would horrify any peacetime practitioner. We worked with inadequate light, insufficient instruments, no antibiotics, and declining supplies of even basic antiseptics. We told ourselves that Japanese spirit would overcome material deficiency, that our dedication compensated for lack of resources. Then I saw an American surgical unit. The cleanliness was what struck me first. Everything sterile, properly packaged, used once and disposed of. The waste seemed criminal until I understood that they could afford to waste because they had so much. The surgeons were not more skilled than ours, but they worked under conditions that allowed their skill to matter. The survival rates spoke for themselves. I had to confront the possibility that we had been sacrificing lives to an ideology that confused deprivation with virtue. The physical transformation of the prisoners themselves became evidence that could not be ignored. Within 6 weeks of adequate nutrition, human bodies begin recovering from chronic malnutrition. Weight increases, energy returns, skin clears, wounds heal at normal rates. The Japanese prisoners, fed on American rations and treated for deficiency diseases, began to look different. They stood straighter. They moved with less exhaustion. They rediscovered energy reserves they had forgotten existed. The contrast with their recent past was too dramatic to attribute to anything other than material conditions. Specifically, food and medicine in quantities sufficient to meet basic biological needs. This physical recovery had psychological dimensions that complicated the prisoners' relationship to their captivity. To feel better in captivity than they had felt in service to the emperor created cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve within the framework of imperial ideology. If American imprisonment provided better living conditions than Japanese military service, what did that imply about the relative strength of the two systems? If the enemy could afford to feed its prisoners better than Japan could feed its own troops, what did that suggest about the likely outcome of the conflict? These were questions that ideology struggled to answer, but bodies had already reached their own conclusions. The presence of female American personnel added another dimension to the ideological challenge. The Japanese prisoners encountered American women serving as nurses, administrators, communications specialists, women who moved through military spaces with professional authority, who spoke to male personnel as colleagues rather than subordinates, who inhabited their bodies with a confidence that reflected different assumptions about gender and capability. These American women were taller, heavier, more physically robust than their Japanese counterparts, products of the same nutritional abundance that had shaped the men. They represented a version of femininity built on sufficiency rather than scarcity, on capability rather than submission, on individual development rather than collective sacrifice. For Japanese women whose entire socialization had emphasized subordination, self-effacement, and service to hierarchical authority, the encounter with American female personnel demonstrated alternative possibilities for organizing gender relations. The American nurses did not defer to doctors in the manner Japanese nurses had been trained to show. They challenged decisions, offered professional opinions, conducted themselves as educated specialists rather than dutiful assistants. They also inhabited their physicality differently, athletic, comfortable in their bodies, unself-conscious about space and movement in ways that Japanese military culture would have read as unfeminine. The basketball games became a recurring symbol in prisoner accounts, mentioned in memoirs and interviews with a frequency that suggests their psychological significance. Watching American soldiers play basketball provided enforced observation of male physicality in motion, jumping, running, competitive but not violent, athletic rather than martial. The game's emphasis on height and reach advantage showcased physical characteristics that American nutrition had cultivated, and that Japanese genetics plus wartime scarcity had made rare. The casual joy of the play, the laughter and banter, the absence of rigid hierarchy in recreational contexts, all demonstrated a military culture that allowed space for individual pleasure rather than demanding total subsumption of self into collective purpose. One prisoner, whose name was withheld in post-war documents, wrote in a statement to American intelligence officers about the impact of observing these games. "We watched them play, and I realized I had never seen Japanese soldiers at play. We had calisthenics, we had drill, we had combat training, but we did not have play. These Americans played like children, without self-consciousness, and then they would return to duty and conduct themselves as soldiers. They had not been forced to sacrifice their humanity to become warriors. They remained whole people who happened to be at war. We had been taught that wholeness was weakness, that only through denial of self could true strength emerge. But watching them, I wondered if we had been wrong. They seemed strong precisely because they had not been required to deny themselves." The concept of athletic beauty, of bodies developed for their own sake, rather than purely for military utility, existed within American culture in ways that Japanese militarism had deliberately suppressed. American physical culture emphasized health, vitality, and aesthetic development, values that presumed sufficient resources to care about form as well as function. Japanese wartime culture had reduced the body to pure instrument, valued only for its utility to the state, maintained at minimum viable levels to preserve combat capability. The American soldiers, whose bodies reflected different priorities, represented an alternative understanding of what human physical development could look like when not constrained by resource scarcity or ideological demands for sacrifice. The female prisoners' responses to this discovery ranged widely, but certain patterns recur in the historical record. Some experienced shame at what they perceived as their own physical inadequacy, interpreting American health as a reproach to Japanese weakness. Others felt anger at the system that had demanded their sacrifice while failing to provide basic support. Many experienced confusion, as the evidence of their senses contradicted the ideological certainty they had been taught. A few experienced something more complex, an attraction that was simultaneously physical, ideological, and philosophical. The American soldiers represented not just healthy bodies, but a social system capable of producing and maintaining such health on a mass scale. And this systemic capacity held implications that extended far beyond individual attraction. This last response was the most dangerous from the perspective of Japanese military culture, because it suggested that individual experiences might lead to broader questioning of national ideology. The imperial system had demanded absolute loyalty and portrayed sacrifice as the highest virtue. Encountering captors who seemed healthier, stronger, and more capable precisely because they came from a system that did not demand absolute sacrifice, posed a challenge to the foundational logic of Japanese militarism. If American abundance could produce superior physical specimens, and if physical capability translated to military effectiveness, then what did that imply about the relationship between ideology and power? American intelligence officers conducting interviews with Japanese prisoners were trained to exploit these contradictions, but the most effective propaganda was simply exposure to American normalcy. Prisoners saw American soldiers receiving packages from home, opening boxes filled with candy, cigarettes, magazines, small luxuries that spoke of a civilian economy still functioning despite years of war. They observed American personnel writing letters with the expectation those letters would be delivered, maintaining connections to families and communities that had not been obliterated by bombing or starvation. They witnessed a military force that retained connection to civilian life rather than existing in total separation from normal human existence. The logistical systems supporting this normalcy were themselves a form of propaganda. American military logistics in the Pacific represented the most sophisticated supply operation in human history to that point. Ships, aircraft, trucks, and trains moving millions of tons of material across thousands of miles to maintain forces engaged in active combat operations at levels of supply that exceeded what most armies enjoyed in peacetime. The casual abundance prisoners observed was not accident, but the result of industrial capacity, organizational sophistication, and resource availability that Japan could not match and could barely comprehend. By spring 1945, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, prisoner camps in the Philippines had become spaces where ideological certainty dissolved in the face of daily material reality. The Japanese prisoners understood intellectually that they were seeing a carefully managed face of American power, that their treatment was influenced by propaganda considerations, that much about their captivity was performance designed to demonstrate American superiority. But intellectual understanding could not fully negate the impact of embodied experience. Bodies that had been hungry were now fed. Bodies that had been sick were now treated. Bodies that had been told the enemy was weak had encountered evidence to the contrary every day for months. The mail from Japanese prisoners that was allowed to pass through Red Cross channels during this period shows the ideological struggle in oblique references and careful language. A letter from Hanako Sato to her family, censored and archived, reads, "I am being treated adequately. The food is sufficient. I am recovering health I had not realized was lost. The Americans are not as we were taught. I do not know what this means for us or for Japan. I hope you are safe. I hope I will see you again in a world that makes sense." The confusion in such letters was genuine, the disorientation of having one's fundamental assumption challenged by experience that could not be easily dismissed. The symbolic power of American athletic bodies persisted in prisoner accounts for decades after the war. In interviews conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, elderly Japanese women who had been prisoners in the Philippines often mentioned the physical appearance of American guards with a specificity that suggested the memory retained emotional significance. They remembered particular individuals: a tall guard with red hair who had shared chocolate, a medic with impossibly white teeth who had treated their illnesses, a young soldier whose gentle manner contradicted everything they had been taught about enemy brutality. These men had become, in memory, ambassadors of a different possibility, embodiments of a social system that could afford to value individual life and health rather than demanding sacrifice unto death. The post-war reconciliation between Japan and the United States was built on many foundations: strategic necessity, Cold War politics, economic reconstruction, cultural exchange. But for some Japanese women who had experienced American captivity, personal memory played a role in accepting the transformation. They had seen, in the bodies and behaviors of their captors, evidence that the American system was not simply militarily superior, but fundamentally different in its treatment of human beings. This did not erase the horror of war or excuse the violence both sides had inflicted. But it did suggest that the American model, with its emphasis on individual welfare, material abundance, and pragmatic rather than ideological organization of society, might offer something Japan needed as it reconstructed itself in the post-war period. The fitness culture that flourished in post-war Japan, the emphasis on nutrition and public health, the transformation of Japanese bodies over subsequent generations from population marked by scarcity to one of the healthiest in the world. All this represented many factors, including American occupation policies, economic recovery, and Japanese adaptation. But the memory of contrast, the awareness that Japanese bodies had been stunted by wartime deprivation, while American bodies flourished with adequate resources, created a determination that future generations would not suffer the same physical disadvantages. The post-war Japanese commitment to nutrition, public health, and physical development can be read partly as response to the humiliation of that discovered inadequacy. In American military archives, the documents related to Japanese female prisoners are scattered and incomplete, minor footnotes to the larger narrative of Pacific War conclusion. But certain reports stand out for their attention to the psychological dimensions of captivity. A military intelligence assessment from June 1945 notes, female Japanese prisoners demonstrate greater willingness to accept re-education than male counterparts. Factors include relief at survival contrary to propaganda predictions, gratitude for medical treatment, shock at abundance of resources available to American forces, and observation of female American personnel in positions of authority. Recommend continued emphasis on demonstrating material superiority and humane treatment as means of undermining enemy ideological commitment. The recommendation was implemented, though the war ended before its full effects could be measured. But the logic was sound. Ideology is vulnerable to contradiction by experience, and bodies provide evidence that minds struggle to dismiss. The Japanese prisoners had been taught a story about American weakness, Japanese superiority, and the inevitability of imperial victory. Their bodies, recovering health in American captivity, told a different story. They had been shown American soldiers whose physical vitality spoke of systemic strength, whose casual competence suggested deeper reserves than propaganda had acknowledged, whose treatment of prisoners demonstrated values different from those they had been taught to expect. The long-term impact of this experience operated at levels both individual and collective. Individual women returned to post-war Japan carrying memories that complicated the simple narratives of victimization and resistance. Collectively, the story of female prisoners, though rarely discussed in official histories, became part of the broader understanding of how total war had failed, how Japanese physical deterioration had reflected systemic collapse, how the American victory had been built not just on military might, but on social organization that could sustain abundant resource distribution even under conditions of total war. August 1945, repatriation. The women stood on the dock at Manila, waiting for the transport that would carry them back to a Japan they had been told no longer existed in the form they remembered. The war was over. The emperor had spoken. The atomic bombs had fallen. Everything they had fought for had ended in surrender that previous propaganda had insisted was impossible. They wore clean clothes provided by American authorities, carried packages of food for the journey, and had been given medical clearances certifying they were healthy enough for travel. Many were healthier than they had been in years, perhaps healthier than they had ever been. Across the dock, American soldiers loaded supplies onto other ships, continuing the work of military logistics that would persist for months as occupation forces deployed and reconstruction began. The soldiers worked shirtless in the tropical heat, their bodies still displaying the physical vigor that had so disturbed prisoner assumptions. Some of the women watched, remembering their own surprised reactions months earlier, understanding now what they had not fully grasped then, that they had witnessed not individual superiority but systemic capability, not personal strength but national power expressed through the most basic measure of all, the ability to keep one's people fed, healthy, and physically capable even under conditions of total war. The transport whistled. The women gathered their belongings and prepared to board. They were going home to a country destroyed, occupied by the forces they had been taught to hate and fear, facing an uncertain future in a world reorganized according to principles their education had never prepared them to accept. But they carried with them something they had not possessed before, empirical evidence that the ideology they had served had failed not just militarily, but in its basic understanding of what made nations strong. They had touched the reality behind the propaganda, had seen in the bodies of their captors proof that abundance was not weakness, that care for individual welfare did not preclude collective strength, that societies organized around material sufficiency could produce humans more physically capable than systems that glorified sacrifice and deprivation. This knowledge would not heal the wounds of war or restore what had been lost, but it would inform how they and their children understood the choices available to post-war Japan. The memory of American bodies, healthy, strong, casual in their vitality, would persist as counterpoint to the nationalist mythology that had led Japan into catastrophic war. In the reconstruction to come, in the debates about what kind of society Japan should become, this memory would provide evidence for those arguing that Japanese strength required Japanese health, that national power demanded adequate care for individual citizens, that the future could not be built on the model that had so comprehensively failed. The transport pulled away from the dock, carrying the women toward a future they could not imagine. Behind them, Manila Harbor bustled with American activity, the victors' casual efficiency in converting war machinery to peacetime purpose, the abundance that could already imagine beyond conflict to reconstruction, the physical and systematic strength that had demonstrated, more powerfully than any manifesto, the advantages of organizing society around sufficiency rather than sacrifice. The lesson was written in the bodies they had observed, the health they had recovered, the strength they had encountered where they had been promised weakness. It was a lesson taught by experience rather than ideology, by bodies rather than words, and precisely because it was embodied, it could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. In the decades that followed, as Japan transformed from occupied ruin to economic power, as Japanese bodies grew taller and stronger with each generation fed on adequate nutrition, as the physical memory of wartime deprivation faded into historical record, the story of what those prisoners had witnessed became footnote rather than centerpiece. But for those who had been there, who had seen American soldiers play basketball in the tropical sun, who had watched American nurses move through hospital wards with professional confidence, who had felt their own bodies recover strength under conditions of captivity better than they had known in service to the emperor for them, the memory retained its force. They had been taught that Americans were weak, and had discovered instead a strength built on foundations their own education had not prepared them to understand. They had been shown the power of abundance, and had learned that deprivation was not virtue but merely deprivation, that sacrifice without support was waste, that bodies told truth ideology could not fully suppress. This was the lesson written in muscle and sinew, in straight backs and white teeth, in casual athletic grace and professional medical competence. It was the lesson of what healthy human beings looked like when their society could afford to keep them healthy, of what strength meant when it was built on sufficiency rather than imposed through denial. It was a lesson taught by victors to the vanquished, but it transcended simple triumphalism to reveal something deeper about the relationship between social organization and human flourishing. The American soldiers had been ambassadors not just of military might, but of a different way of imagining what nations owed to citizens, of what power required as foundation, of what freedom looked like when embodied in human form. The women carried this knowledge home, into a future that would prove the lesson true in ways they could not anticipate. Japan would rebuild, would prosper, would eventually produce generations whose physical stature and health would equal or exceed what they had seen in their captors. But the path to that future required first abandoning the ideologies of sacrifice and deprivation that had led to catastrophic failure. It required accepting that abundance was not weakness, that care for individual welfare strengthened rather than weakened collective power, that the body's truth could not be overruled by ideology's demands. In the end, this was what remained from those months of captivity: the memory of bodies that had not been broken by war, of systems that could sustain health even under total conflict, of men whose physical capability reflected not superior spirit but superior support, and the dawning understanding that Japan had been wrong, comprehensively, foundationally wrong, about the relationship between material conditions and human strength. This knowledge, learned through observation of athletic American bodies, through recovery of health in American captivity, through confrontation with abundance where deprivation had been promised, became part of the foundation on which post-war Japan was built. The lesson was simple, terrible, and true. Nations that could afford to keep their soldiers healthy would defeat nations that demanded sacrifice unto death, and no amount of ideological fervor could overcome the basic reality that well-fed bodies performed better than starving ones. The transport disappeared over the horizon, carrying its cargo of transformed understanding toward a homeland that would itself be transformed. Behind, the harbor continued its work. Ahead, Japan waited in ruins, and in the space between, the women carried their unwilling education, their embodied evidence, their complicated memory of American strength encountered where Japanese propaganda had promised only weakness. It was a memory that would haunt and inform, challenge and instruct, testify to the power of bodies to teach what words could not. The war was over. The lessons remained. And among those lessons, written in the physical reality of the victors, was the truth that abundance was its own ideology, more persuasive than any manifesto, more powerful than any slogan, undeniable as the evidence of healthy bodies moving with casual grace through a world they had proven strong enough to dominate and generous enough to rebuild.